I stepped into the ballroom, my hand resting on my pregnant belly, believing my life was finally secure. Suddenly, a stranger stood up over the violins and clinking glasses. "The baby she is carrying is mine," he announced, holding up medical files, embryo codes, and a legal letter to the Charlotte elite. As everyone waited for my husband, Rhett, to abandon me, he did something that left the room dead silent, and that was just the beginning. I am Blakely Lennox, and at 32 years old, I have spent the better part of my career analyzing the spaces between what people say and what they actually do. As a financial fraud investigator at Crescent Ledger Risk Group in Charlotte, North Carolina, my days are built on finding the hidden ledgers, the offshore shell companies, and the quiet discrepancies that bring empires down. I did not come from old money. I grew up understanding the value of a dollar earned through sweat rather than a dividend yield. So, when I married into the Calder family, I brought my sharp eyes and my grounded reality with me. I refused to let the blinding glare of generational wealth disorient me. My husband, Rhett Calder, was the elegant, undeniable exception to everything I usually distrusted about the ultra-rich. He is the heir to Calder Meridian Holdings, an infrastructure and logistics empire that presents a flawless, philanthropic face to the public while operating with ruthless, calculating precision behind closed boardroom doors. Rhett always felt like a sanctuary away from his family's corporate machinations. He loved me for my mind, my discipline, and my absolute refusal to be intimidated by his surname. For the past 2 years, that love was the only thing that carried us through the brutal, quiet devastation of infertility. Month after month, cycle after cycle of failed in vitro fertilization left me feeling like a failing vessel. But tonight, beneath the cascading crystal chandeliers, my hand rests instinctively against the swell of my stomach. I am 22 weeks pregnant. This little boy, shifting softly inside me, is our first true anchor of hope after 24 months of silent, suffocating pressure. The evening was unfolding inside the grand ballroom of a meticulously restored historic hotel nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Asheville. The room was a masterclass in understated extravagance. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne and sparkling water, weaving through a sea of custom tuxedos and designer silk gowns. The string quartet in the corner played a subdued classical arrangement that floated over the hum of privileged conversation. The Calder family was hosting this gala with a dual purpose to officially announce my pregnancy to their inner circle and, conveniently, to launch a highly publicized maternal health charity. It was exactly the kind of strategic, image-enhancing move my in-laws excelled at. The Calders never stooped to the vulgarity of open hostility. They were not the kind of antagonists you see in cheap soap operas who throw drinks or hurl direct insults. Their cruelty was an art form, refined over generations. They preferred the subtle, chilling methods of exclusion. It was the sudden drop in temperature when I entered a room, the half-smiles that never quite reached their eyes, and the compliments laced with arsenic. They would praise my work ethic in a tone that suggested it was a charming, blue-collar hobby. They mastered the barbed politeness that left you bleeding without a visible wound. Yet, tonight, the atmosphere felt entirely off-axis. Vivian Calder, my mother-in-law, was the epicenter of this strange shift. Normally, Vivian looked at me as if I were a slight miscalculation on a balance sheet. But this evening, she was wearing a smile so sugary it set my teeth on edge. She had hugged me twice since the cocktail hour began, her manicured hands lingering affectionately on my shoulders as she paraded me in front of state senators and tech billionaires. "Our dear Blakely is simply glowing," she cooed to a group of potential donors, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of a doting grandmother. It made my stomach tighten. Vivian did not do warmth unless there was a camera recording it or a strategic advantage to be gained. Her sudden affection felt less like acceptance and more like a carefully staged performance. As the time approached for the main speeches, my professional instincts, the same ones that flagged fraudulent wire transfers, began to scream that something was fundamentally wrong. I excused myself from a conversation with a verbose banking executive and took a slow, deliberate look around the perimeter of the ballroom. I noticed the security personnel first. The Calders had employed the same private security firm for over a decade, but tonight, I spotted at least 3 unfamiliar faces stationed near the main exits. They were standing a little too rigidly, their eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that felt out of place for a charity gala. Then there was the matter of the guest list. I had reviewed the seating chart just 3 hours before the event, but as I glanced at the tables near the front, I saw place cards being hastily rearranged by the event coordinator. People I had never heard of were suddenly seated in prime sightlines of the podium. My gaze shifted to the foyer, catching sight of my brother-in-law, Maddox. He was standing just outside the heavy mahogany doors, half hidden in the shadows of an ornate floral arrangement. Maddox was usually the life of any party, aggressively networking and charming the room. But tonight, he was isolated, his head bowed as his thumbs flew frantically across his phone screen. He looked up, his eyes darting toward the main entrance, before quickly returning to his screen. He was waiting for something. Or someone. Rhett materialized beside me, pulling me gently from my escalating anxiety. He smelled of cedar and expensive cologne, a familiar, comforting presence in a room full of strangers and shifting shadows. He slipped his hand into mine, his thumb tracing the knuckles in a soothing, rhythmic motion. "You are doing beautifully," Rhett murmured, leaning in close so only I could hear. "Just one speech, a few more forced smiles for the cameras, and then I will take you upstairs. You can kick off those heels, and we will order room service." I looked up at him, searching his green eyes for any sign that he felt the same undercurrent of dread that was currently wrapping tightly around my chest. He looked entirely serene, deeply happy, and utterly unaware of the invisible tripwires I felt all around us. "Vivian is acting strange," I whispered, keeping my expression pleasantly neutral for anyone who might be watching. "And Maddox has been hovering near the door for the last 20 minutes. Did you change the security team?" Rhett offered a soft, dismissive chuckle, pulling me slightly closer. "My mother is just excited about the baby, Blakely. It is her first grandchild. And you know Maddox. He is probably just trying to manage some minor crisis with a supplier. Do not let your investigator brain work overtime tonight. This is our night. Everything is perfect." He kissed my temple, a warm, reassuring gesture meant to ground me. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to surrender to the idea that the 2 years of heartbreak were finally behind us, that this baby had miraculously thawed the glacial walls of the Calder family, and that this grand, opulent evening was simply a celebration of our expanding family. But as I let Rhett lead me toward the front of the room, my hand tightened instinctively over my stomach. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, practically vibrating with an unspoken tension. It was the kind of absolute stillness that only ever precedes a devastating drop in barometric pressure. The room was too quiet, the smiles were too wide, and the pieces on the board were moving in a pattern I could not yet decipher. I knew, with the cold certainty of a woman who makes her living uncovering lies, that this was not true peace. It was just the flawless, pristine cover story before everything blew apart. Rhett raised his crystal flute, tapping the rim lightly with a silver spoon. The sharp, bright chime cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom, instantly commanding the attention of the 300 guests. The string quartet faded into silence. Rhett smiled down at me, his expression radiant and unguarded. "To my beautiful wife," Rhett began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly over the state-of-the-art sound system. "And to the little boy who will be joining our family in exactly 18 weeks." The room swelled with polite, measured applause, a wave of diamonds and designer suits shifting toward us in a collective gesture of high society approval. I felt a fleeting second of triumph, but before the applause could peak, a voice sliced through the elegant noise. "Excuse me." It was not a shout. It lacked the frantic, unhinged energy of a drunk guest or a confused interloper. The voice was steady, projecting with the practiced authority of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment. The crowd near the back of the room parted like a zipper unfastening. retreating from the sudden disruption. A man walked down the center aisle, directly toward the illuminated podium. He appeared to be in his late 30s, dressed in a dark, sharply tailored suit that still lacked the bespoke, effortless drape of the Calder men. He did not look intimidated by the wealth surrounding him. He moved with a terrifying, purposeful confidence. He came to a halt, roughly 15 feet from where we stood. He squared his shoulders, ensuring his profile was perfectly angled toward the event photographers who had frozen with their lenses still raised. "My name is Evan Trower," the man announced. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum. "I am not here to ruin a celebration. I am here to prevent an uncorrectable legal mistake." Rhett stepped instantly in front of me, shielding my body with his own. "Security," Rhett commanded, his tone dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "Remove him. Now." Evan Trower did not flinch as 2 guards sprinted down the side aisles. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, transparent plastic folder. He held it up high, catching the glare of the chandeliers. "The child Blakely is carrying does not belong to her," Evan declared, his voice ringing out with devastating clarity. "And it certainly does not belong to Rhett Calder. The genetic material used to create that embryo belongs to me. It was unlawfully acquired from the cryogenic storage facility she used." The collective gasp from the room felt like the oxygen being sucked out of the building. I felt the blood drain completely from my face, a cold, sickening rush that left my fingertips numb. My hand clamped down on Rhett's forearm, my nails digging into the fabric of his tuxedo. "I have the authorized laboratory records from Piedmont Reproductive Medicine," Evan continued rapidly, raising his voice to speak over the heavy footsteps of the approaching guards. "I have the storage transfer logs dated October 12th. I have the specific embryo identification numbers matching the exact batch implanted on November 3rd. And I have a formal legal injunction drafted by my reproductive rights attorney, demanding an immediate halt to any parental rights claims by the Calder family." With a swift, practiced motion, he unclasped the folder and pulled out a large, fold-out chart printed on heavy stock paper. He held it up for the front rows to see. It was a meticulously crafted timeline, displaying color-coded bars that detailed every medical appointment, every transfer date, and every lab result I had experienced over the past 8 months. It looked impeccably professional. It looked like the truth. The atmosphere in the ballroom mutated in a matter of seconds. The guests, who just moments ago had been raising their glasses in a toast to my unborn son, transformed into an impromptu, merciless jury. The warmth evaporated, replaced by the sterile, freezing air of a public tribunal. I saw a state senator lean over and whisper behind his hand to a real estate developer. I saw women staring at my stomach, their eyes wide with a horrifying mixture of morbid curiosity and utter disgust. The murmurs began, a low, vicious buzzing that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. They were looking at me as if I were a master grifter, a desperate woman who had smuggled stolen genetic material into a billion-dollar bloodline. Vivian Calder reacted with the terrifying, cold-blooded grace of an apex predator. She did not scream. She did not clutch her chest or faint into the arms of a waiter. She stepped smoothly up to the microphone, gently but firmly nudging Rhett to the side. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vivian said. Her voice dripped with sorrowful, commanding authority, projecting the image of a matriarch desperately trying to shield her flock. "I am so deeply sorry for this intrusion. This evening is officially over. Please, I ask that you enjoy the rest of the hospitality in the downstairs lounge. We must address this immediately. This kind of vulgar spectacle could destroy our family reputation." She framed the disaster brilliantly. She did not say her daughter-in-law was innocent. She did not call the man a liar. She called the situation a spectacle, subtly shifting the priority from my defense to the preservation of the Calder name. Immediately, Maddox materialized at my right side. He did not touch me, but his body language formed a rigid, inescapable barricade. "We need to get her off the floor, into the private dining room behind the kitchens," Maddox said. His voice was a low, urgent hiss. directed over my head to his brother, but meant entirely for me to hear. "I am calling Harrison right now. We need the corporate counsel on site in 20 minutes, and get Dr. Aris on the line. We need our own independent medical evaluation immediately." He was not talking about a doctor to check on my blood pressure or my stress levels. He was talking about a doctor to verify the stranger's claims. He was managing a corporate liability. He was processing a suspect. The trap was closing, and they were orchestrating it right in front of me. "I do not know him," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling as I pushed past the tight, suffocating knot in my throat. I looked frantically from Rhett to Vivian to Maddox. "Rhett, I swear to God, I have never seen that man in my entire life. This is insane." The security guards finally grabbed Evan by the shoulders, twisting his arms behind his back. As they dragged him backward toward the exit, he casually tossed the stack of documents onto the edge of the nearest dinner table. My eyes locked onto the papers. My professional instincts, honed by years of analyzing forged ledgers and fabricated invoices, forced me to look closer. I could read the top sheet perfectly from where I stood. It was a flawless replica of the exact intake form I had signed on a rainy Tuesday morning in late summer. The 9-digit patient identification number printed at the top was 100% accurate. The embryo grade, listed as 4AA, was typed neatly in the middle of the page. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, a frantic, bruising rhythm. The most terrifying part of this nightmare was not that a stranger was shouting lies in a crowded ballroom. The truly paralyzing horror was that his lies were printed on pages that perfectly matched the intimate, agonizing reality of my fertility treatments. The codes, the dates, the lab terminology, it was all entirely too precise to be a clumsy, random extortion attempt. This was not a mistake. Someone with immense resources and access to my most protected medical secrets had meticulously engineered this bomb, and they had just detonated it in the center of my life. Maddox's hand hovered inches from my elbow, ready to escort me into the shadows like a disgraced employee. "Let us go, Blakely," he urged, his voice tight. "We have a crisis management protocol for a reason." I braced myself for Rhett to turn to me, to ask the inevitable question, to demand an explanation for the documents lying on the pristine white tablecloth. But Rhett did not look at me. He did not look at the papers. He looked at his brother. "Back away from her, Maddox," Rhett said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a lethal density that made Maddox freeze instantly. Rhett stepped around me, moving with a deliberate, terrifying calm. He did not walk toward Evan Trower, who was still struggling half-heartedly against the security guards near the exit. Instead, Rhett walked straight up the steps to the podium and took the microphone directly from his mother's hand. Vivian blinked, her perfectly composed mask slipping for a fraction of a second. Rhett tapped the microphone once. "To the audiovisual team at the back," he commanded, his gaze sweeping up to the control booth overlooking the ballroom. "Do not cut the feed. Keep every single camera rolling. I want the audio and the video recording continuously. If one single frame is missing from tonight's archives, I will personally see to it that your company never works in this state again." A collective shudder seemed to ripple through the room. This was not the protocol. Wealthy families like the Calders survived by burying their scandals in windowless conference rooms, not by broadcasting them. Rhett turned his attention to his brother and his mother, though his voice was amplified for the 300 silent guests to hear. "No one is taking my wife into a private room. No one is calling Harrison or any other corporate attorney on the Calder Meridian payroll to handle this. Blakely will not be subjected to an internal interrogation, and absolutely no family lawyer is going to make a single decision on her behalf tonight." Vivian's jaw tightened. "Rhett, darling, please," she hissed, leaning toward him, though mindful of the hot microphone. "You are acting on emotion. We are trying to protect the family." "I am protecting my family right now," Rhett replied smoothly. Then, in a gesture that made the entire ballroom stop breathing, Rhett raised his right hand. On his ring finger sat the Calder signet ring, a heavy, solid gold crest that had been passed down through 4 generations of men who built empires and crushed rivals. It was the ultimate symbol of his allegiance, his inheritance, and his power. Slowly, deliberately. Rhett twisted the ring off his finger. He walked over to the nearest table, a display of champagne towers, and placed the gold band down onto the silver tray. The heavy clink of the metal against the silver echoed sharply through the microphone. It was a declaration of war. He was publicly stripping himself of the family armor to stand entirely naked beside me. Rhett turned his piercing green eyes toward the back of the room, where the guards were holding the stranger. "Do not throw him out," Rhett ordered the security team. "Bring him back inside." The guards hesitated, entirely confused by the contradictory orders, but Rhett's authority was absolute. They released their grip just enough to let Evan stand upright, though they flanked him tightly. "Mr. Trower," Rhett said, addressing the man with a chilling, formal politeness. "If you came here with a legitimate, serious legal claim, then you have nothing to hide. We will not be settling this in a back room. We will not be cutting you a check in the shadows to make you disappear. This will be handled in the absolute blinding light of day. It will be investigated publicly, independently, and with the full force of federal law enforcement if necessary. If your documents are real, you will have your day in court. But if I find out you have falsified medical records to extort my wife, I will not just sue you. I will dismantle every single piece of your life." Evan swallowed hard, the first flicker of genuine fear crossing his features. He had expected panic. He had expected a quiet payoff. He had not expected a man willing to burn his own house down to light up the truth. Rhett then swept his gaze over the audience. The elite of Charlotte, the politicians, the developers, the socialites, they all shrank back slightly under his scrutiny. "As for the rest of you," Rhett continued, his tone dropping to a deadly, quiet register, "you all received an invitation tonight because you are considered friends of this family. But let me be entirely clear. If any person in this room breathes a single unverified word about my wife, her pregnancy, or the absurd theater you just witnessed to the press, a blog, or a country club gossip circle, you will hear from my personal litigators by tomorrow morning. I will drain your trusts. I will tie up your businesses in discovery for the next 10 years. Consider this your only warning." The silence was so profound I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents above us. Rhett's calmness was significantly more terrifying than any screaming fit or physical altercation could ever be. He had not thrown a single punch, but he had just intellectually and socially brutalized everyone who dared to view me as a target. Vivian stepped forward, her face flushed with a rare, barely contained fury. She abandoned the microphone, stepping close enough to Rhett that only the front row and I could hear her. "Rhett," Vivian demanded, her voice a sharp, venomous whip. "Stop this foolishness right now. You are jeopardizing billions of dollars in shareholder confidence. You need to think like a Calder." Rhett looked down at his mother, his expression entirely devoid of the familial deference she demanded. "Tonight, Mother, I am thinking like a husband," Rhett replied. He did not wait for her response. He stepped down from the podium, leaving the gold signet ring resting beside the empty champagne glasses. He walked across the patterned carpet, his eyes locked firmly on mine. When he reached me, he took my hand. His grip was warm, steady, and anchoring. He did not pull or drag me. He simply waited for me to step forward with him. Together, we turned our backs on Vivian, on Maddox, on Evan Trower, and on the 300 gaping faces of high society. We walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting for us in stunned, absolute silence. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind us, cutting off the suffocating air of the ballroom. As we stepped out into the cool, crisp mountain air of the hotel courtyard, my knees finally threatened to buckle. Rhett caught me instantly, wrapping his arms securely around my waist, guiding me toward the waiting town car his driver had already brought around. We rode in silence for the first few miles, the dark, winding roads of the Blue Ridge Mountains blurring past the tinted windows. My mind was racing, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred, the flawless execution of the stranger's documents, and the shocking sacrificial defense my husband had mounted. I pulled my phone from my evening clutch, needing to check the time, needing something to anchor me to reality. The screen illuminated the dark back seat. It was exactly 10:45 in the evening. Barely 20 minutes had passed since Evan Trower had shouted his first accusation over the string quartet. But as my screen lit up, a notification banner dropped down from the top of the display. It was a push alert from a highly trafficked, anonymous local society blog that catered to the affluent neighborhoods of Charlotte. My thumb hovered over it, a sickening sense of dread washing over me. I tapped the alert. The headline glared back at me in bold, black letters: "Billion-dollar bloodline bust. Embryo scandal rocks Calder Gala." Below the headline was a blurry, zoomed-in photograph of Evan Trower holding up the plastic folder of medical records, taken from an angle near the front tables. The article already contained specific details about the reproductive clinic, the exact legal phrasing Evan had used, and the implication that the Calder heir was carrying stolen genetic property. I handed the phone silently to Rhett. The glow from the screen illuminated his sharp jawline as he read the brief, devastating article. "They posted this 20 minutes after it happened," I whispered, the terrifying realization solidifying in my chest. "Rhett, a gossip blog does not write an article that detailed, with clinic names and legal quotes, in 20 minutes. Rhett stared at the screen, the fierce protective anger from the ballroom slowly morphing into a cold, hardened realization. "No, they do not. Someone had to give them the details beforehand," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. "Someone had this article prepped and ready to publish the second that man stood up." Rhett handed the phone back to me, his green eyes dark and unreadable. He looked out the window into the pitch-black night. The stranger crashing the party was not an accident. The documents were not a fluke, and the immediate media leak was the final, undeniable proof. Someone inside that ballroom, someone within the very inner circle of the Calder family, had orchestrated this entire nightmare from the beginning. We arrived at our temporary penthouse in uptown Charlotte just past 1 o'clock in the morning. The sprawling, minimalist apartment, a stopgap while our primary residence underwent renovations, had never felt colder. There were no soft reassurances waiting for us inside. Rhett did not pull me into his arms and whisper gentle promises that everything would magically resolve itself. We did not hold each other and pretend the foundation of our lives had not just been fractured. Instead, we sat on opposite ends of the long marble kitchen island, the harsh city lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of the only question that mattered now: who built this trap? At 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the sleek, glass-paneled offices of Crescent Ledger Risk Group. I was currently leading a massive offshore embezzlement audit, a case I had meticulously built over the past 6 months. I needed the familiar rhythm of spreadsheets and wire transfer logs to anchor my spiraling mind. But before I even reached my desk, my managing partner intercepted me and guided me into his corner office. He did not offer me a seat. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of corporate pity and ruthless self-preservation. "Blakely, we are placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately," he said smoothly, avoiding my eyes. "The media cycle this morning is incredibly hostile. We cannot have our lead financial fraud investigator trending on a dozen social media platforms for alleged medical theft and identity deception. It is an optics nightmare. We need to distance the firm until your personal matters are legally resolved." I felt a hot, prickling wave of humiliation wash over my neck. I was being sidelined. My professional integrity, the one thing I had built entirely on my own merit without a single drop of Calder influence, was bleeding out because of a manufactured society spectacle. I nodded curtly, turned on my heel, and walked out of the building. By 9:30, I was back in the quiet isolation of my home office. The initial sting of humiliation had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hyper-focused fury. I was a forensic investigator. I hunted ghosts hidden deep inside complex corporate ledgers for a living. I opened my personal laptop and pulled up the high-resolution images of Evan's documents that Rhett's private security detail had managed to photograph before the man was hauled out of the ballroom. I zoomed in on the alleged laboratory report. I stared at the cryopreservation log, letting my eyes blur slightly to catch the overall structure of the data rather than the terrifying words. Something immediately gnawed at my analytical brain. I pulled my own authentic files from Piedmont Reproductive Medicine out of the locked fireproof safe under my desk. I laid them side by side on the mahogany wood. I compared the cold storage alphanumeric identification strings. Then, I saw it. The formatting architecture was fundamentally wrong. Piedmont utilized a specific 7-character sequence with a hard hyphen before the nitrogen tank assignment number. The forged document Evan held displayed a smooth 9-digit sequence with 0 hyphenation. Furthermore, the barcode at the bottom of his supposed lab sheet was a standard code 128 barcode, heavily used in freight shipping and commercial logistics. Piedmont Reproductive Medicine exclusively used a proprietary 2-dimensional matrix to track biological samples and prevent catastrophic cross-contamination. Evan's handlers had used a corporate supply chain template to forge a deeply protected medical document. It was a brilliant, highly funded forgery, but it was drafted by someone who understood inventory management, not biological storage protocols. Armed with this specific discrepancy, I called Rhett. By 2 in the afternoon, we were sitting side by side in the austere, aggressively modern office of Mara Quill. She was one of the most ruthless reproductive disputes and privacy rights litigators on the East Coast. Mara did not offer us warm tea or false hope. She leaned across her walnut desk, her hands folded neatly over a yellow legal pad. If this Evan Trower files an emergency injunction properly in family court, Mara explained, her voice entirely devoid of comforting emotion, your pregnancy ceases to be a private medical condition and becomes a highly contested evidentiary asset. They can petition for DNA extraction immediately upon birth. They can drag you into a jurisdictional nightmare that will last for at least 2 years, freezing your parental rights while the courts untangle the proprietary claims of the genetic material. They do not have to prove he is the father today. They only have to prove there is enough reasonable doubt to freeze the Calder estate's lineage. The room felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. I looked at Rhett, expecting to see my own paralyzing terror reflected in his face. Instead, I saw a dark, agonizing guilt pooling in his green eyes. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. They tried to lay the groundwork for this, Rhett said, his voice dropping an entire octave, heavy with self-loathing. Roughly 30 days ago, I turned my entire body toward him, my blood running instantly cold. What are you talking about? Rhett looked down at his hands, unable to meet my gaze. Harrison, the primary family trust attorney, brought me a routine portfolio update last month. Buried in the back of the binder was a newly drafted, highly irregular addendum. It was titled Heir Determination Protocols. It included incredibly invasive, unprecedented stipulations about verifying the strict biological provenance of any future children before any trust voting rights could officially vest. And you did not tell me. My voice was barely a whisper. I refused to sign it. Rhett defended himself quickly, finally looking up. I threw the document back across his desk and told him it was insulting. I thought it was just my mother being her usual paranoid, legally controlling self. I thought it was a petty insult directed at my choice of wife. I did not connect it to a staged, multi-million-dollar attack on our child. The betrayal hit me with more force than the stranger shouting in the ballroom. I stood up, my chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. You kept that from me, I demanded, my voice now trembling with a rage I could no longer contain. A month ago, your family lawyers handed you a legal mechanism specifically designed to question the legitimacy of our unborn child, and you did not think that was relevant operational information for your pregnant wife. Rhett stood up, reaching desperately for my arm. Blakely, I was protecting you from their poison. You were already stressed with the hormone injections. I shut it down. I did not know they were actively engineering a proxy war. You left me entirely blind, I shouted, pulling my arm out of his grasp. For the first time since the nightmare began, I was not just terrified of the unseen enemy orchestrating this chaos. I felt completely isolated inside a rigged game with rules I was not permitted to read. We argued fiercely right there in front of the lawyer, the air in the room cracking with absolute exhaustion and terror. It was not a petty argument born of fading affection. It was the sickening, shared realization that we were standing in the middle of a minefield that had been deliberately planted weeks, perhaps months, before Evan Trower ever picked up a microphone. Rhett had missed the warning signs because he viewed his family through the lens of a son dealing with difficult relatives. I would have seen the warning signs because I view the world through the lens of an investigator hunting for a motive. I walked over to the expansive window of Mara's office, looking down at the crawling afternoon traffic of the city. I placed my hands firmly on my stomach, feeling a tiny, distinct kick against my palm. The baby was moving. A protective, absolute fury settled deep into the marrow of my bones, burning away the last remnants of my shock. I turned back to face Rhett and Mara. My tears were entirely gone. The panicked, victimized wife, who needed her powerful husband to shield her from the elite society wolves, was dead. Get me the corporate registry filings for the shell companies associated with the law firm listed on Evan's paperwork, I told Mara, my voice as steady and cold as a steel blade. I looked directly at my husband. I am not waiting for your family to drop the next bomb. Rhett, they used corporate logistics to forge my life. I am going to tear their entire machine apart, ledger by ledger, until I find the person who wrote the check. Mara Quill did not waste time with pleasantries or gentle reassurances. By 10 o'clock the following morning, she had ushered Rhett and me into a soundproof conference room 2 floors beneath her main office. Sitting across the polished mahogany table was a woman with sharp, exhausted eyes and a posture practically rigid with defensive anxiety. Her name was Dr. Lena Hart. Until exactly 7 months ago, she had been the senior embryologist at Piedmont Reproductive Medicine, the very clinic where our son was conceived. Lena was terminated for cause, Mara stated bluntly, pacing the length of the frosted glass wall. Or, at least, that is what the non-disclosure agreement and the severance package dictate. The reality is that she flagged multiple catastrophic failures in the clinic's chain of custody protocols. She found biological material logged under incorrect patient identification tags. When she threatened to alert the medical board, the corporate management fired her and buried her under a mountain of aggressive litigation. I slid the high-resolution prints of Evan Trower's supposed evidence across the table. Lena picked them up, her eyes scanning the alphanumeric sequences with the speed of someone reading a second language. "This is pure fiction," Lena said, her voice completely flat. She tapped a polished fingernail against the primary laboratory intake sheet. "The letterhead is a perfect replica, but this specific embryo identification code, it belongs to a batch sequence from 4 years ago. Specifically, it belongs to a lot of non-viable samples that were legally mandated for destruction due to a catastrophic cryogenic tank failure. Someone pulled a dead number from the archival database and pasted it onto a clean patient template. So, the document is a composite," I said, my forensic instincts fully overriding my lingering trauma. "It is a Frankenstein," Lena confirmed. "But they needed an inside connection to get that specific dead code. Only a senior lab technician or a high-level administrator would have the security clearance to access the destroyed sample logs." The revelation sent a massive jolt of adrenaline straight through my system. I opened my encrypted laptop, connecting to a secure virtual private network. I had managed to pull the digital metadata from the initial legal filing Evan's attorney had blasted to the family court docket the previous afternoon. As a financial fraud investigator, I spent my life tearing apart digital footprints. A liar can forge a signature, but they rarely remember to scrub the hidden timestamps embedded in the file architecture. I ran the scanned files through a forensic extraction software. The results loaded across my screen in bright, undeniable text. "Look at this," I told Rhett. pointing to the creation dates on the right side of the monitor. A genuine medical file builds over time. You would see a document created in August, another modified in September, a lab result added in November. But the metadata on Evan's entire legal package shows every single file was generated, compiled, and saved within a 48-hour window just 2 weeks ago. They were all created on the exact same operating system, using the identical version of a commercial document editor. It was not a historical record. It was a fabricated movie prop, but the clinic absolutely had to be involved. I cross-referenced the dates of my actual embryo transfer with the server maintenance logs Lena had managed to copy onto a flash drive before she was locked out of the building. There it was, a glaring, highly convenient gap. The clinic's localized security camera feeds and digital door access logs were completely purged for a 6-hour window on the exact day I was in the surgical suite. It was logged in the system as a routine server migration error. "Someone inside the clinic wiped the tape," I whispered, a fresh chill racing down my spine. They erased the footage that would explicitly prove I was the only person receiving that specific genetic material. If there was an inside man, there was a payroll. People do not risk federal medical tampering charges out of the goodness of their hearts. I turned my attention to the retainer fee listed on the demand letter from Evan's aggressive boutique law firm. I spent the next 4 hours doing exactly what Crescent Ledger Risk Group paid me a highly lucrative salary to do. I hunted the money. The law firm had received a wire transfer of $50,000. The origin account belonged to a Delaware-registered consulting firm named Apex Horizon Solutions. It was a classic shell company, a corporate ghost with no functioning website, no physical office, and a registered agent located in a desolate strip mall. I dug deeper, pulling state franchise tax records and cross-referencing the subsidiary networks. Apex Horizon was entirely funded by a secondary holding trust. And that specific trust received its primary annual endowments directly from the Calder Maternal Health Foundation, the exact charity Vivian Calder had proudly launched at the gala. They were using philanthropic tax shelters to finance a targeted hit job on my pregnancy. "I have the money trail," I said, my voice eerily calm as I turned the laptop screen toward Rhett. "Your mother authorized the funding for this entire operation through the charity's discretionary accounts, washing it through 3 layers of corporate ghost entities." Rhett stared at the screen, his face draining of all color. The final, fragile illusion of his family's fundamental decency shattered right there in the sterile conference room. Mara leaned over my shoulder, tapping a separate file she had just received from her contracted private investigator. "And the star of the show is not exactly a grieving, victimized father seeking justice," she announced. She dropped a thin manila folder onto the table. It contained the real background check on Evan Trower. "Mr. Trower does not work in tech, and he certainly does not have the net worth to afford boutique reproductive litigation," Mara explained. "He is a former medical logistics courier. He used to drive the transport vans that moved cryogenic tanks between regional hospitals. He was fired 18 months ago for allegedly stealing pharmaceutical supplies. He is currently over $100,000 in debt to a pair of illegal sports betting syndicates." "He is a mercenary," Rhett said, his voice hard and hollow. "Worse," Mara corrected. "He is a professional liability. 3 years ago, he was paid $10,000 to be a surprise eyewitness in a corporate negligence lawsuit in Atlanta. The presiding judge threw out his testimony because it sounded entirely rehearsed. He is a hired gun who reads whatever script you hand him, as long as you clear his gambling debts." Rhett pulled his own phone from his pocket. He had spent the morning aggressively interrogating the executive assistants at Calder Meridian Holdings, utilizing his remaining authority before his mother could officially lock him out of the corporate communications servers. "It gets significantly colder," Rhett said, pulling up an archived email thread. I managed to access the master event logistics file for the gala. 3 days before the party, the internal communications director, who reports directly to my brother Maddox, sent a revised schedule to the audiovisual crew. Rhett handed me the phone. I read the highlighted text. The directive was explicitly clear. It demanded that the main spotlight operator lock the beam exactly on the center of the room at 9:15 in the evening, precisely when Rhett was scheduled to give his toast. It also strictly instructed the camera crew to ensure a wide-angle shot was actively recording the guest reactions during that specific 3-minute window. They did not just know it was going to happen, Rhett said, his jaw tight. Maddox effectively directed the lighting and the camera blocking for the disruption. They wanted maximum visibility. They needed the social destruction to be caught perfectly on tape. I leaned back in my chair, the heavy, clinical silence of the room pressing against my ears. The puzzle pieces had completely snapped together, revealing a picture so grotesque it defied standard human cruelty. This was never about a random stranger attempting a clumsy extortion. This was not a desperate man acting on confused grief. This was a fully budgeted, meticulously scripted corporate assassination. The Calder family had weaponized stolen medical data, hired a desperate actor, manipulated philanthropic funds, and utilized military-grade public relations tactics for one single, terrifying objective. They were trying to mentally and legally break me. They wanted to force me into a quiet, humiliating settlement, ensuring my child would never threaten their bloodline or their balance sheets. From this moment forward, the narrative shifted entirely. They thought I would crumble under the public shame. They thought I would retreat into the shadows and surrender my child to their lawyers. They vastly underestimated the woman Rhett had married. I was no longer a terrified wife caught in a high society scandal. I was an investigator staring at a brilliantly constructed fraud. And I knew exactly how to burn their entire empire to the ground. I sat alone at the kitchen island of the temporary penthouse, the harsh blue light of Rhett's unlocked tablet illuminating the dark marble. I had spent the last 3 hours pulling down his archived calendar files and synchronized email logs, searching for any digital anomalies in the weeks leading up to the gala. I was looking for external threats, but the system flagged an internal pattern that made the breath catch in my throat. Buried under a heavily encrypted, mislabeled administrative folder were 2 calendar entries. The first was logged on a Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon. The second was marked for Thursday at 10 in the morning. They had occurred exactly 48 and 24 hours before the ballroom disaster. The location for both was a private, off-the-books conference room at the Calder Meridian corporate headquarters. The attendee list consisted of 3 names: Rhett, Maddox, and Harrison, the lead family trust attorney. The sound of the front door unlocking echoed through the quiet apartment. Rhett walked in, dropping his keys onto the credenza. He looked entirely exhausted, the sharp lines of his face drawn tight with the stress of fighting his own bloodline. He walked toward the kitchen, stopping when he saw the tablet angled toward him. "You met with them," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth. I did not yell. The quietness of my tone was far more dangerous. "2 private meetings with your brother and the family lawyer right before the gala. Right before my entire life was ripped apart on a stage." Rhett froze, his eyes darting from the screen to my face. "Blakely, it is not what it looks like." "Do not insult my intelligence," I snapped, standing up. "You told me yesterday that you rejected their heir determination protocol a month ago. You made it sound like an isolated incident, but you were sitting in a room with them mere hours before Evan Trower crashed our party. Did you know what they were going to do? Did you know they had a mercenary waiting in the wings?" "No," Rhett said firmly, taking a step forward. "I swear to God, I had no idea about the forged lab reports or the fake father. They called those meetings to pressure me into a voluntary leave of absence from the executive board. They claimed my refusal to sign the trust addendum was creating a liability. They were trying to push me out quietly. I fought them the entire time. I thought it was just standard corporate warfare." "Standard corporate warfare," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I crossed my arms over my chest, staring at the man I loved, realizing how heavily his wealth insulated him from the brutal reality of his own family. "You are missing the fundamental motive, Rhett. Why now? Why are they so completely desperate to cast doubt on my pregnancy that they would risk federal charges to forge a medical document I am not going to ask you again?" Am I simply a convenient incubator for your family's inheritance war? Rhett stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The accusation hit him like a physical blow, stripping away the last remnants of his protective, aristocratic armor. He closed his eyes, dragging a hand roughly through his hair. When he looked at me again, the final guarded secret of the Calder family was written plainly across his face. My grandfather did not trust Vivian, Rhett began, his voice dropping into a hollow, defeated register. He knew my mother would eventually try to consolidate total control over the holding company. Before he died, he amended the master trust. The clause states that the first biological grandchild born into my legal marriage will instantly inherit a block of 30% of the Class A voting shares upon reaching their 18th birthday. I stared at him, my mind rapidly calculating the financial gravity of his words. 30% of a multinational infrastructure empire was not just a trust fund, it was the absolute power to dictate the future of the board. Maddox is currently trying to push through a massive corporate restructuring, Rhett continued, his eyes locked on mine. He wants to acquire a failing European logistics network, but the board is deeply divided. He needs absolute, unassailable control. If our son is born, and his legitimacy is legally unchallenged, that future 30% voting bloc becomes active in the corporate calculus today. The board will hesitate to approve Maddox's merger if they know my heir will eventually hold veto power over the consolidated debt. The sheer, sickening scale of the conspiracy finally crystallized in my mind. They did not just view me as an unsuitable, middle-class wife. They viewed my unborn baby as a catastrophic financial liability. But if the paternity is contested before the birth, I deduced, my investigative instincts tracing the legal architecture of their trap. If Evan Trower files an injunction and drags the genetic origin into court, the trust transfer is frozen pending a judicial resolution. Yes, Rhett whispered. The shares remain locked in escrow. Maddox remains the sole, uncontested successor. He gets the runway he needs to close the merger and dilute the remaining shares before our son ever takes a breath. I felt a sudden, profound wave of vertigo. I reached out, gripping the edge of the marble island to steady myself. The Calder family was terrified of me. They were absolutely paralyzed by the thought that my child would dismantle their carefully engineered succession plan. They had decided to destroy my sanity and my reputation simply to freeze a line on a corporate cap table. You knew about this clause our entire marriage, I said, the betrayal cutting deeper than the financial revelation. You watched me endure 2 years of agonizing fertility treatments, crying in bathroom stalls, feeling like my body was failing us, and you never once mentioned that our success would trigger a billion-dollar boardroom war. I wanted to protect you from them, Rhett pleaded, closing the distance between us. He reached for my hands, but I stepped back, out of his reach. I thought if I kept the financial mechanics away from you, we could just be a normal family. We are not a normal family, I fired back, my voice finally cracking with the sheer weight of the deception. And your protection left me entirely blind to a sniper trained directly on my stomach. I refuse to be a womb attached to shares. Rhett, I refuse to let my baby be treated like a hostile corporate takeover. I turned around, walking briskly toward the master bedroom. I pulled a leather duffel bag from the closet and began throwing a few basic necessities inside. I was not crying. I was operating on pure, cold adrenaline. Rhett stood in the doorway, his face pale, but he did not try to physically stop me. He knew he had lost the right to ask me to stay in this apartment tonight. I am not leaving you because I do not love you, I told him as I zipped the bag shut. I am leaving tonight because I need to breathe air that does not feel like a lie. I need to figure out how to destroy them without you trying to soften the blow. I checked into a quiet, heavily secured boutique hotel across town. At 2 a.m, while I was staring at the ceiling, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a highly encrypted email from Dr. Lena Hart. There was no text in the body of the message, only an attached image file. I opened the attachment. It was an archived back-end server log from the clinic's digital infrastructure. Lena had highlighted a specific string of code in bright yellow. It was a digital access receipt, showing the exact date and time an administrative override had been used to access my confidential patient profile and alter the storage batch numbers. I checked the timestamp. The alteration had not occurred after my pregnancy was announced. The data manipulation had been executed 3 weeks before my embryo transfer ever took place. A new, freezing terror washed over me, instantly eclipsed by a volcanic rage. I was not swept up in a sudden panic after the gala. I was targeted from the very beginning. They had pre-selected my failure. They had built the guillotine before I even knew I was pregnant. At 7 o'clock the next morning, I walked back into our temporary penthouse. Rhett was sitting on the edge of the sofa, still wearing the clothes from yesterday. He looked up, the raw desperation in his eyes painfully clear. I dropped my bag onto the floor and walked straight up to him. I tossed my phone onto the coffee table, displaying the server log Lena had sent. They built the trap before I was even on the surgical table. I told him, my voice completely steady. Rhett looked at the timestamp, the last trace of his familial loyalty burning away into ash right in front of me. He stood up, his jaw set with a lethal determination. "No more secrets," I said, holding his gaze with absolute authority. "No more trying to protect me by hiding half the truth. I do not want a shield. Rhett, I want a sword. We either win this together, entirely in the light, or we burn together." Rhett reached out, taking my face firmly in his hands. There was no hesitation left in him. "We burn them to the ground," he promised. The beige stucco exterior of the suburban office park looked exactly like the kind of place where dirty money went to disappear. It was Tuesday morning, and the Carolina sun was already baking the asphalt, as Rhett and I walked into the cramped reception area of a supposed consulting agency. The man sitting behind the veneer desk was Arthur Vance, a mid-level certified public accountant who managed the books for Apex Horizon Solutions. He looked up, his eyes widening in immediate recognition as Rhett Calder filled the narrow doorway. Rhett did not introduce himself. He walked straight to the desk and dropped a heavy leather-bound folder onto the blotter. "That is a draft of a federal subpoena," Rhett said, his voice stripped of all its usual polished charm. "It demands the unredacted ledgers for every transaction routed through Apex Horizon over the last 12 months. My attorneys are currently sitting outside the federal courthouse downtown. If I make one phone call, they will file it. You will be named as a co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud and criminal extortion ring." Arthur swallowed hard, the color draining completely from his face. He looked at the heavy folder, then up at Rhett, and finally at me. He was a man who calculated risk for a living, and he instantly realized he was entirely outmatched. "I am just a contracted bookkeeper," Arthur stammered, his hands trembling as he hovered over his keyboard. "I do not ask questions about the operational expenditures. I just process the invoices." "Then process this for me," I interjected, stepping forward to lean my hands flat against his desk. "Show me the exact line items for the crisis mitigation package authorized by Vivian Calder. I know the money flowed through the charity. I want to see where it landed." Arthur hesitated for only a fraction of a second before his survival instinct overrode his non-disclosure agreement. He typed a rapid sequence of passwords, turning his monitor toward us. The screen displayed a master ledger that was a masterclass in financial obfuscation, but to my trained eyes, it read like a simple roadmap. There it was. A discretionary fund completely bypassing the standard oversight board, approved directly by a digital signature belonging to Vivian. The allocations were brutally clear. $50,000 wired to the boutique law firm representing Evan Trower. A secondary payment of $30,000 sent to an offshore cryptocurrency wallet, clearly the fee for the digital mercenary who hacked the clinic and forged the laboratory documents. And perhaps the most sickening line item of all, $15,000 paid to the holding company that owned the local society gossip blog. Vivian had not just funded the nightmare, she had meticulously budgeted for its public distribution. Rhett pulled out his phone, snapping high-resolution photos of the screen. "We are done here," Rhett told the trembling accountant. "If you alert anyone in my family that we were here, I will make sure the federal prosecutors know you were an active architect of this scheme, not just a bystander." We left Arthur hyperventilating in his chair and drove back to our temporary penthouse in complete silence. The sheer mechanical coldness of the ledger had shifted something fundamental inside both of us. But as I sat down at the kitchen island and began cross-referencing the dates of the wire transfers, a massive, glaring inconsistency struck me. "This is too much money, Rhett," I said, pulling up a fresh spreadsheet. "They spent nearly $100,000 just to stage the initial disruption. They are prepared to spend millions in legal fees to drag this through family court. You do not burn that kind of capital just because you think your daughter-in-law is a middle-class gold digger. Class snobbery is arrogant, but it is deeply frugal. There is a massive financial hemorrhage happening somewhere else in your company, and our baby is threatening to expose it." Rhett stood perfectly still, his green eyes darkening as his mind raced through the corporate architecture of his family's empire. He walked over to his briefcase, pulling out a strictly confidential quarterly earnings projection he had secured before his mother could restrict his access. He spread the dense financial reports across the marble counter. "The European logistics acquisition," Rhett whispered, his finger tracing a line of red ink on the balance sheet. 18 months ago, Maddox convinced the board to acquire a massive, failing freight network in Germany. He promised it would double our international footprint. Instead, it has been a catastrophic cash bleed. Calder Meridian Holdings is currently carrying over $800 million in syndicated debt just to keep those ports operational." I leaned over the documents, my forensic training instantly dissecting the debt structure. If a company is that dangerously over-leveraged, the lending banks impose incredibly strict debt covenants, I noted. They demand absolute stability in the executive control structure. If there is a sudden change in leadership, or a sudden shift in the voting shares, the banks have the right to call the loans immediately. "Exactly," Rhett confirmed, the realization hitting him with devastating force. Maddox is currently negotiating a desperate refinancing deal to roll that debt over and save the company from defaulting. To secure that deal, he needs to present himself to the global creditors as the absolute, undisputed, and permanent heir to the Calder empire. The entire terrifying landscape of their motive finally snapped into perfect focus. If I gave birth to a legally recognized son, the grandfather's trust clause would eventually activate. A massive 30% voting bloc would shift away from Maddox's control. Even though the child would not vote for 18 years, the mere existence of that guaranteed future transfer would legally require Maddox to disclose a fundamental shift in the company's long-term capitalization table to the creditors today. The banks would instantly panic, the refinancing deal would collapse, and Maddox would go down in corporate history as the man who bankrupted his own family. "That is why Vivian chose an embryo ownership scandal," I said, the absolute brilliance of her cruelty making my stomach turn. "If she accused me of an affair, a simple cheek swab the day the baby was born would definitively prove Rhett is the father. The scandal would be over in 24 hours. But intellectual property laws regarding genetic material, jurisdictional disputes over lab storage contracts, that can be dragged through the appellate courts for 5 years. She had engineered a legal purgatory. It was modern, it was unprecedented, and it was entirely designed to push me into a dark, exhausting gray area. She knew the public would scrutinize me, the courts would drain me, and eventually, out of sheer mental collapse, I would sign a suffocating non-disclosure agreement to protect my sanity, quietly surrendering the trust shares just to make the nightmare stop. My phone vibrated against the marble counter. It was an encrypted message from Dr. Lena Hart. She had managed to track down a former administrative assistant who worked the reception desk at the clinic before the mass firings. The message contained a brief, recorded voice note. I hit play. The audio was grainy, but the woman's voice was clear. She confirmed that exactly 6 months ago, well before my embryo transfer was scheduled, Maddox Calder had taken a private, unguided tour of the clinic's server rooms and data storage vaults. He had arrived under the immaculate disguise of a wealthy philanthropist, dangling a $2 million research grant from the Calder Maternal Health Foundation. He had essentially paid them to open their digital doors, allowing his hired security consultants to map the vulnerabilities in the system under the guise of an audit. He had the blueprints to my medical history before I even walked into the surgical suite. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, gleaming skyline of Charlotte. The buildings looked like massive monuments to power and untouchable wealth. For my entire life, I had believed that if you worked hard, followed the rules, and maintained your integrity, the truth would always be your ultimate defense. But the Calder family did not care about the truth. They only cared about the narrative they could afford to purchase. They did not just want to smear my reputation. They wanted to fundamentally erase my right to tell my own story. They wanted to reduce my desperately wanted child to a contested asset, a shameful footnote buried in the restricted annex of their family history. They wanted me to look back on this pregnancy not with joy, but with traumatized, paralyzing fear. I placed my hands firmly against my stomach. The baby shifted, a strong, undeniable movement that radiated through my entire body. A quiet, terrifying calm settled over me. It was the absolute stillness of a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything in the world to destroy. I turned back to Rhett. He was watching me, waiting for my cue. I was no longer interested in standing in front of a judge and politely begging for my name to be cleared. I was no longer interested in simply surviving the storm they had paid to unleash upon me. I was going to dismantle the very foundation of the machine that thought it could erase me from the future of my own child. I sat at the glass desk in the penthouse office, staring at a blank document. If the Calder family wanted a paper war, I was going to give them a masterpiece. I knew exactly how they operated now. They were arrogant enough to believe my digital security was still compromised. We had discovered a sophisticated piece of spyware buried deep within the synchronization software of my personal laptop. Installed months ago, instead of deleting it and tipping our hand, I decided to feed the beast. I drafted a highly technical, fabricated document. I titled it as a recently recovered chain of custody log from the clinic's internal audit. I meticulously formatted it to mirror the authentic files Lena had shown me. But buried in the fourth paragraph, within a dense string of cryogenic storage protocols, I planted a microscopic, highly specific technical typo. I spelled the cryoprotectant chemical dimethyl sulfoxide as dimethyl sulfoxide, dropping a single, unnoticeable letter in the middle of the word. It was a mistake no certified embryologist would ever make, but a corporate lawyer scanning rapidly for leverage would miss it entirely. I saved the file to my compromised cloud drive and went to sleep. 72 hours later, my trap snapped shut. Mara Quill summoned us to her office. Evan Trower's legal team had just submitted a supplemental evidence binder to the family court, claiming an anonymous whistleblower had provided them with missing clinic logs to solidify their case. Mara slid the thick stack of papers across her desk. I flipped straight to the fourth page. There it was, dimethyl sulfoxide. They had stolen my poisoned bait, printed it on high-quality legal stock, and submitted it to a federal judge. They had just legally verified that their evidence was not coming from the clinic's secure archives, but from my hacked hard drive. "We have them," I whispered, tracing the misspelled word with my index finger. They just submitted a forged document derived from a planted source. Mara did not smile. She was a predator who understood the value of patience. "We do not reveal this to the judge yet. If we expose the forgery in a simple motion today, they will just withdraw the document and claim they were misled by a third party. We need them to bleed on the record. I am going to schedule a closed pre-mediation session. We will frame it as a preliminary settlement discussion. My absolute goal is to force their lead counsel to formally authenticate this specific document on the legal transcript. Once they swear it is real under oath, perjury attaches to everyone in the room." The mechanics of the counterattack were falling into place, but we needed the kill shot. We needed the expert to verify the fatal flaws in their timeline. I met with Dr. Lena Hart in a subterranean coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. She looked paler than the last time I saw her, clutching her paper cup with trembling hands. If I step into that room, my career in reproductive medicine is permanently over, Lena said, her voice tight with suppressed panic. The Calder family will make sure I am blacklisted across the entire eastern seaboard. If you do not step into that room, they win, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. I did not offer her empty platitudes or gentle comforts. They destroyed your reputation to cover their tracks. I am offering you the chance to burn the people who burned you. We will keep your name entirely off the witness list until the absolute final hour. Mara will file you as an unnamed expert consultant until the doors lock behind us. Lena stared into her coffee for a long, agonizing minute before giving a single, sharp nod. While I managed the legal logistics, Rhett was performing a surgical strike on his own family's history. He had spent 3 days quietly bypassing the firewall of his grandfather's archived private server, using old administrative backdoors he had installed during his early days at the holding company. Late on a Friday night, he walked into the kitchen, a stack of freshly printed emails in his hand. The paper felt heavy with betrayal. My mother claims she only found out about the trust clause recently, Rhett said, his voice dropping into a hollow, dangerous register. She claimed she was just a desperate mother acting to protect her son's corporate future when she realized my grandfather had set a trap. He laid the emails on the marble island. They were dated 7 years ago. The correspondence was between Vivian and the former lead counsel of the estate. The emails explicitly discussed the 30% voting block attached to any future legitimate grandchild. She had not been surprised by the clause. She had been actively monitoring my fertility journey for 2 years, calculating the exact moment a pregnancy would trigger the financial shift. Her defense of maternal desperation was entirely fabricated. It was premeditated, calculated greed. With the evidence mounting, my focus shifted to my own physical and mental preparation. For a week, our temporary penthouse transformed into a war room. I plastered the walls with timelines, financial wire transfers, burner phone records, and the offshore shell company structures. I was no longer an emotional, frightened, expectant mother. I reverted to the coldest, most disciplined version of my professional self. I forced Mara to run brutal, unforgiving mock depositions. She paced the living room, hurling every vile, degrading accusation the Calder legal team would inevitably use against me. She attacked my background, my fertility struggles, and my character. Whenever my heart rate spiked, whenever my hands instinctively moved to protect my pregnant belly, I stopped the simulation. I practiced my breathing. I leveled my voice. I trained my facial expressions to project nothing but absolute, terrifying calm. I would not allow them to use my pregnancy, my hormones, or my fear as a weapon against me in a boardroom or a courtroom. I would be a fortress of logic. We had the financial records. We had the trapped forgery. We had the motive spanning 7 years. We had the whistle-blowing embryologist. I was ready to close the net. But I had momentarily forgotten a cardinal rule of fraud investigation. When cornered, a rat does not surrender. It bites the hardest. On Tuesday morning, exactly 48 hours before the scheduled pre-mediation, Mara Quill burst into the penthouse without knocking. She threw her leather briefcase onto the sofa, her face a mask of absolute fury. "They beat us to the courthouse," Mara said, her breathing heavy. "Maddox just filed an emergency injunction in federal court." Rhett stepped out of the hallway, instantly on alert. "An injunction for what?" "We already know they are contesting the paternity." "They changed the narrative," Mara said, pulling a thick, court-stamped document from her bag. She looked directly at me, her eyes filled with a terrifying urgency. "Maddox is not just claiming Evan Trower is the father anymore. He is claiming that Blakely is the criminal mastermind." The air vanished from my lungs. "The filing alleges that after 2 years of failed fertility treatments, Blakely snapped," Mara read from the petition, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "They are claiming that, utilizing her advanced skills as a financial fraud investigator, she hacked the clinic's digital infrastructure. They are accusing you, Blakely, of altering the chain of custody logs to steal a viable, highly graded embryo belonging to an anonymous wealthy couple, and then paying Evan Trower to act as a distraction while you legitimize the pregnancy. I stared at the paperwork, the sheer audacity of the lie paralyzing my mind. Maddox had taken every single piece of my professional expertise and weaponized it against me, because I investigated fraud for a living. He was painting me as the only person capable of executing such a flawless medical forgery. He was not just trying to take my baby anymore. He was trying to send me to federal prison for medical theft. We thought we had set the perfect trap, but Maddox had just flipped the entire board over, leaving me standing in the exact center of the crosshairs. The scheduling was a masterstroke of absolute corporate strangulation. The federal judge granted the emergency injunction hearing for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Simultaneously, Vivian orchestrated a special session of the Calder Meridian Board of Directors set for 11 o'clock that exact same day. It was no longer just a bitter family dispute over genetic material. It was a synchronized, multi-million-dollar war for control of the company, designed to force Rhett to choose between defending his pregnant wife in a courtroom or saving his voting rights in the boardroom. Maddox wanted us divided, fighting on two fronts with zero margin for error. The world outside our temporary penthouse had transformed into a hostile, screaming circus. News vans were permanently parked on the street below our balcony. Online, the story had violently mutated from a bizarre society scandal into a vicious true crime spectacle. Anonymous sources leaked heavily redacted, entirely out of context fragments of my professional history. The internet branded me a mastermind. The headlines shifted from questioning the clinic to openly dissecting my morality. I was labeled a fraudulent incubator who had orchestrated a biological heist to secure a billion-dollar inheritance. Commentators debated whether my marriage to Rhett was a genuine romance or a calculated merger built on stolen DNA. Every time I opened my phone, thousands of strangers were aggressively voting on whether or not I deserved to keep my own child. The collateral damage hit my career with swift, merciless precision. On Monday afternoon, the senior managing partner at Crescent Ledger Risk Group requested a virtual meeting. He did not ask how I was holding up. His voice was a sterile, corporate drone as he informed me that my temporary administrative leave was being converted into an indefinite, unpaid suspension. The firm's major institutional clients were threatening to pull their retainers. They could not tolerate a lead fraud investigator who was currently the subject of a federal injunction for medical forgery. He heavily implied that if my name was not completely cleared by the end of the week, the firm would move forward with a permanent termination to protect their brand equity. The one thing I had built with my own hands, my entirely independent professional identity, was being systematically dismantled. The psychological warfare extended far beyond the digital world. Maddox and Vivian knew that stress was a biological weapon. They wanted me exhausted, paranoid, and prone to making a fatal mistake on the witness stand. By my 26th week of pregnancy, the subtle intimidation tactics became impossible to ignore. When I attended my routine ultrasound appointment, a man in a sharply tailored but generic gray suit stood perfectly still near the lobby elevators, his eyes tracking my every movement. When Rhett and I went for a brief walk in a secluded city park, a black sport utility vehicle idled at the curb, its tinted windows facing us the entire time. They never approached. They never spoke a threatening word. They simply existed in my peripheral vision, a constant, suffocating reminder that my safety was an illusion and that their reach was absolute. The relentless pressure finally breached the walls of our apartment on Tuesday night. The air inside the penthouse felt incredibly thin. I was sitting on the floor of the nursery we had barely started decorating, sorting through stacks of subpoenaed bank records, my back aching under the growing weight of my pregnancy. Rhett walked into the room, his face a landscape of pure exhaustion. He sat down beside me on the plush carpet and gently took the highlighters and the legal pads out of my hands. "We can stop this," Rhett said, his voice cracking with a desperate, agonizing vulnerability I had never heard from him before. "I can call Harrison right now. We can sign the non-disclosure agreement. I will surrender my claim to the 30% voting block, and I will walk away from the holding company entirely. We can take whatever liquid capital I have left, move to the coast, and just disappear. They will drop the injunction. They will call off the media dogs. We can just be a family in peace. He was not giving up because he was weak. He was offering to sacrifice his entire birthright because he was watching the woman he loved crack under the weight of a global scandal, and he was terrified for the health of our unborn son. The temptation to surrender was incredibly powerful. A single signature would turn off the noise, dismiss the paparazzi, and guarantee my physical safety. But I looked at the empty crib in the corner of the room, and a cold, resolute fire hardened in my chest. If we sign that paper, Rhett, we are not buying peace, I told him, gripping his hands tightly. We are buying a cage. If we run, Vivian and Maddox own the narrative forever. They will tell the world, and eventually they will tell our son, that his mother was a fraud who fled when she was caught. I will not let my child grow up as a dirty family secret purchased by a settlement check. We do not negotiate with people who tried to steal our life. We finish this. Rhett looked into my eyes, seeing the absolute finality in my decision. He nodded once, burying his face in my shoulder, drawing a ragged breath as we committed to walking straight into the fire. But on Wednesday evening, just 14 hours before the federal judge was scheduled to hit the gavel, the foundation of our entire counterattack suddenly crumbled. Mara Quill called the penthouse. Her usually composed voice was tight with suppressed panic. "Evan Trower is gone," Mara announced. "My private investigator went to serve him with the final witness summons. His apartment is completely cleaned out. His burner phones are disconnected. His vehicle is missing. He has vanished." A sickening wave of dread crashed over me. Our entire strategy hinged on breaking Evan in that closed mediation room or on the stand. We needed the hired mercenary to panic under oath and confess to the financial arrangement. Without Evan physically present to be cross-examined, Maddox's legal team could easily claim the forged documents were submitted in good faith, blaming the anonymous whistleblower. If Evan disappeared, the forgery accusation against me would stand entirely unchallenged. We were holding a brilliant trap, but the prey had just chewed off its own leg to escape. At 2 a.m, while I was staring blindly at the ceiling, my encrypted personal phone buzzed against the nightstand. It was an incoming call from an unregistered international routing number. I answered it, holding my breath. There was no live voice on the other end, only the automated beep of a pre-recorded voicemail being forwarded through a proxy server. Then, a frantic, breathless voice filled the quiet bedroom. "Listen to me. Blakely." Evan Trower's voice crackled through the speaker. He sounded terrified, the arrogant confidence from the ballroom completely erased. "I know you found the money. I know you found the metadata. Maddox's security guys paid me a visit tonight. They told me I'm going to take the fall for the federal tampering charges. They are going to frame me as a rogue extortionist to protect the holding company. I want to tell the judge the truth. I want to tell them Vivian wrote the script. But if I walk into that courthouse tomorrow, the Calder family will make sure I never walk out of a prison cell. I am so sorry." The line went dead. I sat up in the dark, the voicemail echoing in my mind. Evan wanted to jump ship, but his fear of the Calder empire was paralyzing. He had confirmed our entire theory, but a recorded voicemail from a proxy server was completely inadmissible in a federal courtroom. It was useless unless he actually walked through those heavy oak doors and sat in the witness chair. And I had absolutely no way of knowing if he possessed the courage to show up, or if he was currently driving toward the Canadian border. The sun began to rise over Charlotte, casting long, sharp shadows across the penthouse floor. It was Judgment Day. I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the fabric of my tailored maternity dress over my heavy stomach. My professional reputation was shattered. My husband's corporate legacy was hanging by a thread. I gathered the thick leather binders of evidence, knowing perfectly well that logic and forensic accounting might not be enough to defeat billions of dollars of entrenched power. I took Rhett's hand, and we walked out the door, stepping directly into the terrifying void, with absolutely no guarantee that the truth was going to win. The federal courtroom was a cathedral of polished oak and freezing air conditioning, but the atmosphere was suffocating. At 9 o'clock exactly, the emergency injunction hearing commenced. Vivian and Maddox sat at the petitioner's table, looking like the absolute picture of aggrieved aristocratic dignity. Their legal team, a phalanx of expensive suits, immediately seized the narrative. They brought in a hired medical ethicist who spoke in measured, sorrowful tones, presenting thick, leather-bound dossiers. They carefully framed me not as a victim, but as a desperate, highly skilled financial investigator who had exploited the complex gray areas of reproductive medicine to secure my place in a billionaire dynasty. They painted Maddox as the responsible corporate steward, simply trying to protect the integrity of the Calder bloodline from my alleged biological heist. When it was our turn, Mara Quill did not call me to the stand to weep or beg for sympathy. I did not offer an emotional defense of my motherhood. I approached the witness box with the cold, absolute precision of an auditor dismantling a fraudulent shell corporation. Their entire timeline is a digital fabrication, I stated, my voice ringing out clearly across the silent courtroom. I directed the judge to the supplemental evidence binders we had submitted. I did not speak about feelings. I spoke about data. I walked the court through the metadata extraction, proving that every single file Evan Trower submitted had been generated within a 48-hour window on a single operating system, rather than built over 9 months of actual medical history. I pointed out the structural formatting errors in their forged cryogenic logs. Then, I delivered the fatal blow. 2 days ago, the petitioners submitted a newly discovered chain of custody log to this court, I said, holding up their own exhibit. They claimed it came from an anonymous clinic whistleblower. But if you look at paragraph 4, the word dimethyl sulfoxide is missing the letter L. It is spelled dimethyl sulfoxide. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy. I know this, Your Honor, because I intentionally planted that exact typographical error in a decoy document on my personal hard drive 4 days ago. The petitioners did not get this from a medical database. They stole it from my hacked computer, printed it, and submitted it to this court under oath. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Vivian's flawless posture rigidified. Her lead attorney frantically began flipping through his own copies, the color completely draining from his face, before the defense could scramble to object. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Dr. Lena Hart walked down the center aisle, her head held high. Mara immediately called her as an emergency expert witness, under oath. Lena systematically dismantled the medical viability of the Calder narrative. She testified that the specific transfer protocols required for the embryo batch Evan claimed as his own were fundamentally incompatible with my verified surgical records. It was biologically and procedurally impossible for Evan's alleged genetic material to be the child I was carrying. Vivian, sensing the narrative slipping from her manicured grasp, leaned over to her attorney and violently whispered an instruction. The lawyer stood up, attempting a desperate pivot. He claimed that if the documents were forged, it must have been a rogue extortion scheme orchestrated entirely by the clinic staff and Evan Trower, and that the Calder family were simply innocent victims trying to uncover the truth. They were preparing to throw their hired mercenary directly under the bus, but the doors opened one final time. Evan Trower walked in, flanked by a federal public defender. He looked completely shattered, his eyes darting frantically toward Maddox and Vivian. He had heard the voicemail. He knew he was being set up to take the sole fall for federal medical tampering and perjury. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of the offshore wire transfers, the burner phone records we had subpoenaed, and the terrifying prospect of serving decades in a federal penitentiary alone, Evan broke completely. Evan took the stand and confessed to every single detail. He admitted he was paid $50,000 through a corporate shell entity to play the role of the legally robbed father. He testified that he had memorized a script meticulously drafted by Vivian's crisis management team. He looked directly at the judge and stated that Maddox Calder had promised to wipe out over $100,000 in illicit gambling debt if Evan successfully pushed me into a silent settlement agreement that surrendered my child's inheritance rights. The courtroom erupted, The judge hammered the gavel violently, demanding order. But while the room was still reeling from the explosive confession, Rhett stood up from his seat beside me. He did not look at the judge. He looked directly at his mother and his brother. "I am not just standing here as a husband." Rhett's voice cut through the chaos like a heavy blade, carrying the full, terrifying authority of the Calder name. "I am standing here as a primary voting shareholder of Calder Meridian Holdings." Rhett pulled a sealed legal envelope from his jacket and handed it to the court clerk. "I am officially activating the emergency executive proxy granted to me by the late founder of the trust. Effective immediately, I am casting my controlling votes to temporarily suspend Vivian Calder and Maddox Calder from all executive and board-level positions within the holding company, pending a full federal investigation into their use of corporate and philanthropic funds for criminal extortion." Maddox leaped out of his chair, his face flushed purple with rage, screaming that Rhett did not have the authority. But Rhett was not finished. He turned to face the gallery, where several prominent business journalists were furiously typing on their phones. "Furthermore," Rhett declared, his voice unwavering, "I am formally renouncing any and all personal inheritance tied to my compliance with this family. I am immediately transferring my entire block of grandfathered voting rights into an irrevocable blind protective trust. And I am naming my wife, Blakely Lennox, as the sole legal guardian and executor of that trust on behalf of our unborn son." My family thought they could buy her silence. Instead, they just handed her the keys to their empire. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the thick binder containing all the emails, the wire transfers to the offshore accounts, and the ledgers proving the charity had been looted to fund the attack. He walked right past his mother's frantic, reaching hands, and dropped the entire binder directly onto the desk of the federal prosecutor who had been observing the hearing from the front row. "There will be no non-disclosure agreements," Rhett said, staring down his mother with eyes as cold as absolute zero. "There will be no quiet settlements. You wanted a public trial. You have it." The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. By the time we walked out of the courthouse, the holding company's board of directors had already convened an emergency mutiny, officially stripping Maddox of his title. The international banks, panicked by the criminal implications, immediately froze the European refinancing deal, triggering a catastrophic debt review. The state attorney general announced a freeze on the Calder Maternal Health Foundation pending an audit. Vivian and Maddox had not only lost their unassailable power, they had entirely incinerated the pristine reputation they believed they controlled simply by being born with the right last name. I did not turn back to gloat. I did not scream or demand an apology from the people who had tried to mentally destroy me. True victory did not require noise. It required survival. I stepped out into the bright, blinding Carolina sunlight, the crisp air filling my lungs for what felt like the first time in months. Rhett wrapped his arms securely around my waist, pulling me close. I placed my hand firmly over my pregnant belly, feeling a strong, reassuring kick from the little boy inside me. We walked calmly down the courthouse steps, leaving the flashing cameras and the crumbling dynasty behind us, knowing that the people who had desperately tried to claim my unborn child had ultimately used their own arrogance to completely destroy themselves. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below to chat and share your thoughts with me. And do not forget to subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many others.